This is Chapter 14 of the State and Local Government course, looking a little bit more at economic development. And what we could probably argue is that economic development is probably one of the central priorities of states and local governments. We're looking at trying to improve the economic prosperity for the people that live in these areas, trying to facilitate a rise in per capita income, that's income per person, increase in personal incomes, jobs, available jobs for people. We will talk quite a bit about the trade-offs of the competitiveness, which is part of our capitalist system, but we also see in our federalist system there's quite a bit of competitiveness between states in order to try to attract economic development. For example, a few years back, Virginia won a bid for $500 million Rolls-Royce jet engine facility. 8 states were in the running for that. So a lot of incentives were provided for the company, such as a large industrial zone, skilled workforce, but perhaps even more enticing, lots of incentives in tax breaks, providing of training, additional infrastructure, land. Now the difference between states is shown in the book as far as business competitiveness, and we see there's a variety of ways to attract business and to be competitive with other states, and we see some states that have been highly competitive: Texas, Utah, Washington, Virginia. So some of the things that affect this are the tax burden that we talked about in the last chapter, the amount of percent of income that is taxed by state and local governments, the amount of education and training programs that's available in that region. As far as minimum wage goes, there are about half the states that have a higher minimum wage than the federal requirement of $7.25 an hour. Also, the regulatory environment matters in that whether or not the state and local governments are going to require certain restrictions, whether it's quality, labor standards, environment, things like that. And of course, the availability of venture capital, which is investors that are willing to help support that particular industry. Now, historically, the book talks about several waves of development. Early on in America, we were looking at subsidies, financial assistance from the government to the firm to help them grow, perhaps even shield them or protect them. This is what is called protectionism, particularly protect them from foreign competition, foreign imports, in order that they can survive or that they can produce their product at a cheaper cost to compete. Tax breaks, where government has to decide whether or not the corporate entities will be taxed less on certain things in that region. And then particularly wages were low. We see that the 1970s wave starts to attract new forms of businesses, particularly as we come out of the post-World War II nuclear/computer age. Mentioned already the golden age of capitalism, which was a huge boom, in part motivated by the computer age that we were getting into. Also, venture capital pools were starting to come into fruition here, where funds are earmarked for new businesses that are unable to get financing, so that increases more opportunities for more firms and more ideas to increase potential for development and employment. Small business incubators were facilities for nurturing startup businesses, hence the word incubator, to try to encourage more businesses to come up into a city to put more people to work. As we get into the 90s, there was also a new climate as well. The 90s, first of all, we saw the end of the Cold War, so capitalism had kind of emerged as the go-to economic system pretty much by default. We also see in the 90s lots of new technology as far as the cell phone, digital technology, most importantly the internet. So we have globalization, internet, spurring the 1990s. We started to see what were called enterprise zones, areas that were set aside that offering government incentives for investing in that zone. Clusters is a term where firms concentrate in an area with similar needs, sometimes called the agglomeration effect, where if, for example, the automobile industry starts to form in a certain region, such as Detroit, well, then you're starting to attract other businesses in that region, such as parts and tires and glass. All kinds of other industries will start to be attracted to that area and just create what is called a cluster of that particular type of industry need. Fourth wave, we get into the new century here, the new economy is now taking shape. It's based on global technology, knowledge, information, service, society. Globalization, of course, is which was started pretty much in the 90s. We start to see it becomes even more prominent in trade and telecommunications as we get into the 2000s. And we start to see somewhat of a shift as to more investment into human capital as far as education and training that provides more skilled workforce. Now, as far as the politics of economic growth at the state and local level, the governor pretty much takes the lead. The governor is kind of the lead sales rep for the state to try to motivate, incentivize economic development in that state. Since states have more of a hands-on role as far as trying to get people to work and make their cities operate functionally. So we're looking at things that the governor could form, such as task forces and advisory boards, things like that, in order to come up with ideas to spur economic growth. We see there's an interesting relationship between state and local government officials and business leaders, where the business leaders have somewhat of an advantage because of the importance of trying to create economic development in a state, and they feel like that they have some leverage, that they should be treated more as a public interest rather than a special interest that's lobbying for favors to government. And state and local governments have particularly been favorable towards them in order to get this going. So it's an interesting relationship in that the business leaders may have a little bit more power and leverage because of the importance of that, and government and local officials may be a little bit kind of hemmed in at the mercy of these business interests because it's so important to develop that in your region. So the state would establish centers for economic development, research centers, and incentives for small business development. Certainly, as we've argued before, could be the top priority for state and local governments. Now, looking at some things that states are doing to try to motivate economy, because particularly since the recession and even since the 70s, wages have somewhat stagnated, and we've had a couple of recessions since then. In the Great Recession of 2008, we've been coming out of that for over a decade now. But states that were hit hard by that and cannot create a deficit are still looking at ways to generate business and economic incentives. So tourism is a big one. Got quite a bit of money spent on tourism 8 million jobs approximately, 141 billion in tax revenue as well, because whether it's hotel taxes or sales taxes, tourism brings in revenue for the state governments. And so states have to figure out what can we market in our region that would attract tourism. So every state has got something that they could probably use to market their virtues. And I've mentioned various forms of taxation, such as accommodations tax on hotel, motel room occupancies, things like that. As we get into this sharing economy, there may even be incentives to try to generate tax revenue from new economies such as Airbnb. The arts cultivates education and learning in a region, provides entertainment venues. We do see that the arts can attract business opportunities, tourism. That it is somewhat more of a white collar audience, meaning that's somewhat of a middle to higher income as far as that what attracts to the arts. So considered somewhat of secondary spending. But we know that what makes cities, regardless of how much revenue might bring, one of the things that makes cities more attractive and interesting are the amenities, the extras that the cities have to enjoy life, more conveniences, arts adds to that, and we see that arts, whether it's theaters or any types of entertainment venues, can facilitate revival of downtown areas, economic development. Sports is another big attraction as far as the larger cities wanting to host professional teams. That provides more of a symbolic thing to it as far as having that team in your city that provides fans and some revenue. But there's some trade-offs here. Ownership groups will bid for franchises between cities, a la the states, and the states will provide subsidies in order to try to get that sports team in that city, such as below market leases, rates, tax breaks we've already talked about. Eminent domain is a question there. If the city wants to build a new sports facility, how do they handle the taking of the property? Is it going to be considered somewhat of a public good to have this sports team there? So that brings up other issues. We do see that the owners have some leverage here, and there's been several episodes over the past couple of decades where teams have threatened to leave, and the cities did not give them the accommodations that they wanted, and they split and went to another city, creating perhaps some animosity in that city that was left behind. And the economic studies seem to be fairly consistent in showing that the economic benefits of these sports teams are rather negligible. Obviously, it varies from city to city, but overall, not necessarily bringing in that much jobs or developments, in comparison to what's required to bring the sports team there. And it does tend to divert development from the manufacturing sectors to the service sectors, which is what we've been doing over the past several decades anyway, is converting more from a manufacturing society to a service/information sector. Now, the Olympics, of course, which are a one-time thing, have shown more positive results as far as the economic development that it spurs in order to prepare for that venue, is bringing in revenue, and a lot of that infrastructure that is built for the Olympics ends up staying. So it's not just one sports stadium for a sports team, it's more infrastructure. And so winning an Olympic bid is shown to be more positive as far as long-term economic benefits. Here's a table from the book that shows the sports teams in the United States, and when you look at how many of these have quite a bit of a majority of public funds that were used to pay for that facility, it's quite a bit. Only a few were built by private development funds. You see right here, but quite a few that are well above a majority of public funds, which includes the taxpayer dollars and tax breaks and subsidies and things like that in order to get that stadium built for this team. International trade is provided, particularly since globalization has become a general trend in the world, particularly since the end of World War II, and then even more so since the decline of the Soviet Union that opened up global capitalism. But states can now be players in this international trade, as they can find consumers all over the world of their goods that they consume in their state, and foreign investors that come from other countries can also provide capital to states' development. And so what a state government will do, in part of the governor's job to be that leading sales rep for the state, is to export information, tech support, and financing in order to provide the incentives for attracting foreign investment. So the state government, as I said, is the promoter for this to be a place to invest in. So in order to plug into this international trade, more tech support is required for exporting services, and some states have enormous advantages. Texas and California, not just because of their size, but because of their resources and their population and the skilled labor in their particular industries. They lead in the value of exports to other countries. Foreign investment coming in from other countries results in approximately 5.5 million jobs across the country. Delaware, for example, which is quite an attractive place for corporate setups, that 7% of its workforce is in foreign-owned business. NAFTA, which is currently under modification, is also was set up so that states can't discriminate in favor of a local entity at the risk of discriminating against Canada or Mexico. So that is integrated North America more so, and provided other opportunities and markets for states to either look at exporting their goods or attracting foreign investment. So there's lots of questions about the competitiveness and the strive for economic development, particularly from the government effort. Do the government's efforts make a difference? Well, yes, but we'll talk about how much it may. There's still trade-offs involved. May not always work, but the state is clearly going to provide a favorable climate for labor to work there, and we've got other industries there that could be readily available to suppliers and consumers. The outcomes have been mixed, generally modest, as far as what we're talking about here is the trade-off between the government efforts to do this, which requires government expense in order to attract this business. Amazon, which we've already talked about before already, as we've said, all these firms can use leverage against the state. In this case, a few years back, Amazon ceased construction on a distribution center in South Carolina until South Carolina passed some tax breaks. There's 2,000 projected jobs on that on that particular one, so they could use that with South Carolina in order to try to get some of the benefits that they were wanting. So one of the questions is this, does the government spend too much in trying to attract business? And we've seen some examples already, we'll see a couple more, where competition may actually be counterproductive in attracting that business. So we're seeing a little bit more scrutiny of these incentive packages, which includes tax breaks, low interest loans, infrastructure development. Now, clearly that one's an interesting trade-off, because if that infrastructure provides incentives for other development and it has long-term benefits, yes, we have to take that into account. But as I mentioned before, winning a facility, even if it's a sports team or a big popular firm, there's a lot of symbolism of having it there that may create perceptions that it's going to be a good long-term benefit. And some states are requiring what are called clawbacks, is that because if these firms are not held accountable, then we may never know whether or not it's going to pay off down the long run. So firms, in some cases, in their contracts, if they don't produce the jobs or the development revenue that they are expected to bring, then they may have to pay back some of those subsidies. So that's another part of what states are doing to kind of counteract a little bit of this. So we've got lots of positive examples that in the long run, clearly any company that moves into a region and stays there for many years and puts many people to work for a long time, clearly, there's no question that is going to be a long-term benefit. But if the governments are spending lots of money to attract these businesses, and then we don't know, we cannot predict whether or not they're going to be there for a long time, that's the big question. Now, for example, in the late 80s, Kentucky attracted a Toyota assembly plant that today employs 63 full-time workers and spurred an additional 25,000 jobs in the surrounding area. Clearly, a long-term benefit. But there's also the other examples. Rhode Island obligated $75 million to attract a video game company, and then within a couple of years, the company declared bankruptcy and still owes money to Rhode Island. So this is the big question, is that we don't know. In fact, the company might even decide to move out after a few years, and then that would be before the state could recoup all these costs that it took to get that firm to come there. The firm may then pull out down the road, and they would not have recouped those costs. More examples: Alabama wins a $300 million Mercedes facility, but look at what were some of the costs that they incurred in attracting that facility there. And this is what economists do quite often in these analyses, is it costs the state projected $179,000 per job. So that's going to take quite a while to recoup that investment over time. And you could certainly argue that over a certain long period of time, it would eventually pay off. But there's, again, no guarantee of that. There's no guarantee that the company would be there that long or survive that long. Well, those are some of the questions. Here's another one. Indiana used the clawback provisions when they offered United Airlines $300 million in tax breaks. And when those numbers of jobs that were promised did not get created, United actually paid back $30 million of that money. So this is where states are trying to protect themselves a little bit. This was a fairly famous episode where Amazon conducted a nationwide contest, so to speak, to find a place for its facility. And a lot of economists argued that they would have probably picked this place anyway because of the the manpower that was available, the technology that was available in New York, but they were able, because of this contest working states against each other, was an estimated 3.4 billion in tax breaks and grants from the state and local governments in New York to get Amazon to go there. And then when the political backlash ensued from these large tax breaks and incentives, Amazon felt some political pressure there and they got miffed and pulled out their plans to do that. So again, it's very interesting dynamic here where states are still able to leverage, corporations are able to still leverage states against each other and then even threaten to not put it there after all is said and done. And as I mentioned before, interestingly, federal government could simply require that companies are not allowed to do that. So looking at some more questions, does the government spend this fairly? Who benefits? And so there's been more of a push to link commercial development to social concerns, that housing and employment are going to be part of this equation. Gentrification has been a fairly controversial issue to where cities are trying to revitalize their downtown or their urban areas. Certainly a well-intended effort to do that, but at the same time, they're displacing low-income residents, and where there's what incentives do they give them? What benefits are provided for people that are being moved out of these areas? So that's again one of the questions that yes, you're creating economic development for higher income residents to come in there and live, which would certainly have some economic advantages, but in the interests of fairness and inequality or equities, where is the previous residents, where are they going to? And the city, we've touched on this before, the city might require a developer to pay a price in order to enter that potentially lucrative market in their region because of the amenities that this city is providing, the labor pool, whatever. And so they're trying to get a share of those profits by requiring the developer to pay the city a certain amount in order to actually get into that market. So despite this competition and the expense to attract business development, the perception is still there. Local officials will continue to argue that these concessions will eventually pay off, that they will create jobs and generate economic activity. And as long as the company does set up there and stay there for a while, that is most definitely true. But how long it will take for this to pay off is still a big question mark. And we do know that the firms will still hold leverage against cities to perhaps even require more benefits down the road or threaten to move out. So there's lots of questions there of when it pays off, if it will ever pay off, particularly when you see that the company is going to have to pick a place anyway. The United States in general is still getting that particular firm. We're just not having states compete against each other to get that firm there. And so the local economies are ranked on the quality of life, so that's going to require development, jobs, and amenities. So the startups that are attracted there also is what local economies are ranked on. The level of employment and the traction to move there, increased population growth. Despite the fact that the local government officials will continue to compete against each other for this economic development. Critics argue that this economic activity is just simply relocated from one community to another. The benefits for the United States at large are still there. So the big question is here, are businesses continuing to play states against each other, taking the best package? And the courts have not been really receptive to dealing with this or looking at cases that might be seeking to outlaw the use of corporate tax incentives. So therefore, they're going to maintain that competitive environment as long as either the federal government or courts are reluctant to rule on that. Here are, again, some internet resources that provide some additional information on these